This afternoon, we have Betty Anholt and Charles LeBuff with us. They are going to speak on shelling and the history of shelling on Sanibel. They've written this book, Protecting Sanibel and Captiva Islands, The Conservation Story. Betty has authored 6 books, primarily focused on environment and the history of Florida. She moved to Sanibel in 1969, and she and her husband owned and operated different businesses on the island. And she has explored many parts of Florida via canoe and paddle, including the Everglades. Charles LeBuff moved to Florida in 1952. In 1957, he began a long career with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And in 1958, he moved to the Sanibel Wildlife Refuge, now called Ding Darling, where he retired in 1990. He's served as president of the Sanibel Captiva Audubon Society and was a founding member of SCCF. And he's also served on our city council. Welcome, Charles and Betty.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon and talk about shelling on Sanibel. Believe it or not, I shelled here the first time in 1952. I didn't find any Genonias, but I found some shells that were worthy of being sold to the shell factory, which at that time was located in Bonita Springs. It burned down a few days after my visit here to Sanibel. I just wanted to start off with a little bit about the geology of the island. Sanibel is known as a biogenic island. It's composed of 95% living organisms, very little silica sand in our soil. And of course, there's broken down vegetation that forms some surface mud, but it's primarily the creation of living organisms. And there's very few barrier islands in the U.S. that are predominantly seashell-based. Another one is off the coast of Louisiana called the Chandelier Islands. And as we all know, over time, Sanibel has become famed for its variety and number of seashells. But the seashell formed us, and the seashell maintains our quality of life, basically. If we're in a commercial situation, there are many places now that where seashells are sold, and there were places where seashells were sold many years ago. So Betty will kick it off from that point. Well, I forgot. First of all, Betty and I joined together and wrote this book on the conservation history of Sanibel. It was published by the History Press, and of course we recommend it to all islanders and visitors to get a real good snapshot of how these islands came to be in their present quality. It's all because of conservation, not only of birds and other organisms, but also seashells.
Absolutely, also the seashells. And shells, as Charles said, have been an underpinning of the island, but that's true in so many ways. I mean, physically an underpinning, but shells are a food resource, both for people and for the wildlife here. You can go back to the Calusa as far as the people. They were using all sorts of shell that we use today: oysters, clams, scallops, pen shells, whatever you want to think about, and many more besides. But they were using them in a number of different ways as well. They used them as tools. They used them as construction material for their mounds and middens. And we have in turn used their mounds and middens in large part on things like roads or fill material, sidewalks, variety of ways that we've dug into the mounds and spread them all over creation. The Calusa used tools as decoration. They used them, shaped them, and hung them from their clothing, such as it was, around their neck as pendants. They used the middle column, the columella of horse conchs and lightning whelks, as tools that were shaping tools for their canoes, for other wood objects. They used some of the thinner macrolista shells, the sunrise clams, right? Is that the right word? For actually knives. And of course, all of the food resources, as I said. There are other things as well that they used. But just going forward into homesteader and settler times, once the island started getting settled, people, particularly winter residents, would be moving back and forth along the beaches, picking up shells. And of course, it's a human sort of thing. Look what I found. Oh, look what I found is better than what you found. There were competitions that developed, particularly between the Sisters Hotel, which is now Casabel Resort, and the Matthews, which is now the Island Inn. It's really the beginnings of the shell fair that we have to this day, where they would lay out their finds on a table on their porch and spend Sunday looking at each other's collections. And gradually it attracted people from off island to come look to see what they had. And that was, like I say, that was sort of the beginnings of the shell fair that moved up to the community house back in the early 30s. There are a number of people. I mean, one of the stories is, and I'm not sure about it, but that Anne Morrow Lindbergh and Charles Lindbergh spent their honeymoon behind Captiva on a sailboat, and of course walked the Captiva and Sanibel beaches shelling. Her first introduction to shells, which was culminated in her classic book, Gift from the Sea. But I do know that at least 3 sailing or motorboat excursions came in the 1940s with the Lindberghs and the Newton family going down into the Everglades and also spending time up on Captiva. And then in the 50s, she spent some time there by herself writing that book. Another literary influence was Edna St. Vincent Millay. And her story is kind of a sad one. She came here to go shelling. She had been shelling over on the East Coast with her husband. And they came over on the ferry with their flivver, their car, and checked in at the Palms Hotel, sent their luggage up, and started walking the beach. Her husband, his name is Eugene Boissavant, something like that, realized that she had left her manuscript that she had just completed in the car, and he thought it was safer in the hotel. So he ran back and had it sent up to the room. And when they came back, the hotel was burning down. It was in flames. And they lost everything, all of their clothing, and actually the manuscripts of 2 books. The Conversation at Midnight was a play, and she also had a book or part of a book of poetry that was lost in the flames. also an emerald ring, all of their clothes. She and he kind of crept in and out of hotels going back up north to New York State. It took them, several days. They had no clothing changes or anything. They just trekked on up north. And in the following year, she rewrote the play, and it was published a year later. I have a copy of it at home, which is cool because it tells the story of what happened to it in the preface. And then we come to Dr. Louise Perry. The Perry tracked down part of the Ding Darling National Wildlife Refuge down on the Gulf of Mexico now, is where her home and laboratory had been. She and her husband came here for the first time in 1918, and they came on a steamer at that point. The ferry was not running as yet. And they got off the boat and they looked around and they were not impressed. And she was more than willing to get back on the boat and head somewhere else, but the boat had already left. So they spent the weekend, and the island caught her attention. Whether she started shelling immediately, I don't know, but eventually she became so enamored of not only shells, but all of the marine life here, that her husband built her a laboratory. Let me go back. She was a medical doctor. She actually got her medical degree in 1899, which is pretty darn impressive. And she spent about 15 or 18 years running a eye, nose, ear, and throat clinic in Asheville, North Carolina, which is her hometown. When they came to the island, they eventually retired here, excuse me, in 1924 to the house that they had built on the Gulf called Spindrift. And once they got here, she was very involved with not only the Shell Fair, she was the chairman of it for something like 15 years, but also in scientific research of amphibians, reptiles, shells, fish, you name it, anything that related to the natural wildlife of the islands. One of the things she did back in the 30s was, since alligator hunters had pretty well destroyed the alligator population here on the island, she had alligators imported here from the Everglades so that they would not disappear entirely. She, with some of her colleagues, she was involved with a marine research vessel that was out of Woods Hole Observatory in Massachusetts that was studying the Gulf Stream offshore. She wrote articles with her colleagues and by herself, and eventually wrote a book called The Marine Shells of the West Coast of Florida that is still well known. It's pretty much a classic of the shell life of this area. And one of the things I think is the coolest is that in her laboratory in 1936, she had raised live Genonius. That's just amazing to me. And when you consider that just in the last year or two, our Shell Museum has just managed to do that. 85 years ago, this little lady down on the Gulf of Mexico in her individual lab did that. So it's pretty interesting, pretty cool. With some of her colleagues, they wrote things like the morbidity of fish during freezes on Sanibel. They were well known, published in scientific journals, ecology, science, so forth. And they were featured also in national magazines like the Saturday Evening Post, Collier's, and National Geographic, among other things. They were an interesting bunch of people. So one of the things that she wrote for was a little hometown newspaper called The Islander. It had nothing to do with the Islander that we know today, but it was published in the winter time for 3 or 4 years that we know of. It may have been a little longer than that. But The Islander, I have a copy of the front page of one of them. It looks kind of, this is the Christmas week edition. But they had an editorial in it that I wanted to read, because we kind of think in today's world that we have just discovered conservation, but here in 1936, it was already an important part of their lives. And the editorial reads, "A report has been widely circulated throughout the state that restrictions have been placed on the collection of shells on these islands. So widespread has the report become that several people have written hotels and friends relative to the truth of the matter. The basis for such a canard is founded on the knowledge that the commercial shellers are removing from these beaches tons and tons of shells each week. They bring huge trucks with trailers over here. At the end of their 3 or 4 day stay, they leave with both truck and trailer loaded to their capacity with great varieties of shells. Of course, it will, no doubt, take them years to catch up with the output of nature. But is not such a thing possible? Aside from the actual shells removed, why should our beaches be littered with their crude camps and the subsequent litter? Our shelling is one of our greatest assets, and it is entitled the greatest amount of protection we can give it. Some, no doubt, will say that the great distribution that the commercial men give our shells will act as an advertisement. Maybe so. But we question the value of such advertising. A person who becomes enthused over a shell which he garners from a counter would hardly ever undertake the labor of finding one for himself." The different ways that shells are used include not just recreation or food or a hobby or even scientific studies or literary or art studies, but also economics and conservation and a number of other things. And so I'll give that over to you, Charles.
Okay, thank you, Betty. As I spoke earlier, my first trip to Sanibel was actually a commercial shelling operation. A friend of mine from Estero and I came over to collect live shells we would sell to the shell factory. And when I came back permanently, some 6 years later, there was considerable commercial shelling going on. We didn't have the trailer and trucks so much taking shells from the island, but we had islanders, business people, who harvested shells for driveways and elevating their property. But we had a few people that made their livelihood off of seashells. And of course, the shell shops that I previously mentioned. And one of the commercial shellers was a couple that were actually my closest neighbor from the lighthouse, excluding Tommy and Louise Wood, who lived in quarters 1. But James and Snooky Williams lived in a small cottage that was the remnant building of the Palms Hotel that Betty mentioned. It was owned by the Shanahan family. The Shanahans were early lighthouse keepers, and of course, they intermarried. The Shanahans and the Rutlands intermarried, and the Shanahans became stepbrothers with Clarence Rutland. And one of those Shanahan boys was Webb Shanahan, and it's in my understanding that his family operated the Palms Hotel. Well, Webb Shanahan also became a rural mail carrier and did other types of work. To give you a complete history of, I'll leave shelling for a moment, but what happened in the Depression, Pappy Shanahan, or Webb Shanahan, couldn't pay the taxes on the property. It was adjoining the lighthouse property. And his son-in-law, who lived in North Carolina, loaned him the money to pay the taxes, and paid the taxes. And I think there was some kind of a deed transfer, because years later, the Williamses were shoved off the property, and it was sold for condominium development. But at any rate, Webb Shanahan's nickname was Pappy Shanahan. That's what I called him. And he would travel to North Carolina in the summers, come back to Sanibel in the wintertime. And James and Snooky Williams, Catherine Williams, was Catherine Shanahan Williams, and they had a daughter named Miriam Williams, who I've lost track of. And they had an old beat-up Plymouth station wagon, probably from the late 40s. And they would drive the Sanibel beach looking for beds of ark shells, the little, I know the name, the proper name, is it the great ark or?
Well, there's a wide variety.
Yeah, right. But it's the common ark you see windrowed stacked up on the beach. And they would go out year-round and sit down on the beach and hand-pick the better of the white arks and put them in gunny sacks. Then when they had enough, they would take them to the ferry landing. And the ferry would transport them across, and eventually they would get to Railway Express in Fort Myers, and they were shipped to places like Chicago, and they were used for substrate in aquariums. And they had a very lucrative business. They weren't making a killing, but they were making a living. Because back in those days, living on Sanibel was far less expensive than what it is today. So those are three characters, James, Snooky, Miriam, and Pappy. And then, of course, Tommy Wood, the refuge manager, was a neighbor as I was. And James was afflicted with polio when he was a kid, and he walked bent over, had a hard time negotiating, and he often went to Warm Springs, Georgia. And he told me, and I have no reason to doubt it, that he helped FDR write some of his speeches. The guy was smart as a tack. And one day I was visiting them. I used to do odd jobs for them, like fix leaks in their cistern and their roof and things like that on my time off. And James pulled out this handwritten poem that he had written. I think it's probably 52. It can be pinned down on the elements of the poem. But I personally fell in love with the poem. And I've read it at Audubon meetings, and I've put it in some things that I've written. So I would like to indulge your time and read this for its shelling information and its historical context. It tells a story. It tells about life on the island as it was, things that were currently going on the island. So since the intent of this is, I guess, historical aspects of shelling, it has a complete overview of other types of history of the islands. It's, "Dear Pappy," dictates Sonny Jim between his prayer book and his hymn. "This island's far out on a limb and going to the devil. Without your helpful presence here, the risk is bitter and severe, and Satan's minions revel. Competitors, I grieve to tell, who chase the silver-bearing shell, have chosen methods vile and fell to baffle and to beat us. It routs the Dutch and shames the Jews in Mother Nature's sober ooze. They pour untaxed and moonshine booze to fox us and to cheat us. For when the bivalves get a load, they issue forth from their abode and stagger up the washboard road to find the source of rapture. And need I more the tale extend of truth without a kink or bend? Such innocence as theirs must end, and quickly in their capture. No more they die inside the sea, and leave their shells to yours and me, or others less deserving. Devices slick and underhand thus work their death upon the land, and profit this unholy band with odors few can understand, disturbing and unnerving. And nature in your absence, Pap, has lost her vigor and her snap, and caused a terrible mishap. Thus, through maladministration, the docile moon but slipped her chain and waxed when she was due to wane, thus raining Tophet, Helen Kane, and local perturbation. A most uncommon ebb of tide drew off the waters far and wide, with shrimp and oyster dewy-eyed, left flabbergasted, gasping, and offering amid the stench to minds Armenian and French, an opportunity to clench, nor were they slow at grasping. For when they saw the bay's bare bottom, they cried, "Let's get 'em while we've got 'em." And up there where the narrow pass is, a bridge was built by those jackasses for special fools and thoughtless masses. For as they came across the waters, observant sea cows and shrewd otters exclaimed, "She teeters and she totters," and many folks are too persnickety to relish driving split and lickety across a bridge infirm and rickety. Once here they sing, "We're going home," across the rolling ocean's foam. This lit a light in Kinsey's dome. He wrote a check and signed a note and bought himself another boat, for traffic keeps his fleet afloat. Meanwhile, as doubtless you have learned, the tide in roaring surge returned, and I'll be dogged and damned and durned, but that it brought and cast ashore, here at your home in days of yore, in size of 7 tons or more, a turtle turned upon his back, and causing certain lips to smack. And waking wide the island yak, we stood about a hopeless group, and drooling questioned stew or soup. The Reverend Dr. Thomas Wood said either soup or stew is good, but this great boon by heaven sent belongs to the U.S. government. The turtle perfectly at ease though upside down spoke Portuguese. Said wood whose head is quick and fertile, we cannot kill a talking turtle. And while I don't know what it said, it is something we dare not discredit. Since this event is superhuman, I vote we telephone to Truman. But Truman's not in Washington. He's gone for shooting off his gun to bag some votes for Stevenson. And will he bag more than he frightened? Come Tuesday, we will be enlightened. Meanwhile, the turtle is unhappy. What should we do? Advise us, Pappy. Wise as the owl, a wise old bird, we wait the wisdom of your word. Should our stomachs be that turtle's grave? Should we return to the wave? 'Tis a dilemma that defies us. Perhaps you'll come back and advise us. And for the love of Madge and Myrtle, you ought to see so strange a turtle. For it's so seldom that one sees a turtle speaking Portuguese. His language sounds extremely spooky. With love, James, Miriam, and Snooky. I just love that. It tells a story. The bridge he's writing about is the Gorton Bridge, the first concrete bridge across Blind Pass. And I've forgotten whether Stevenson was running in 50 or 52, so that's the time, 52, so that's the time frame which it covers. Commercial shelling was not only people with shovels and wheelbarrows and hauling shell away, it also included some live shelling guides. And this was a very popular pastime for visitors. And almost any local that had a boat would take people to the mudflats to look for live shells like whelks and the angel wings. I couldn't get that one out. And it became a very popular pastime. And one of the earliest advertising live shell guides was back in the early days was, of course, Esperanza Woodring. And later came Bob Sabatino, who took live shelling trips for many years out of Captiva. And then Sanibel and Jerry Way also did. They went to the mud flats at low tide. A old car spring was a popular tool. You take a leaf of a car spring, you'd find the siphon of a angel wing and shove that down and pry the live angel wing out of the mud. There were many, many angel wings taken. And then another popular type of live shelling were dredging trips. Jake Stokes, who was the first employee of the Fish and Wildlife Service at what is now Ding Darling, later became a popular shelling and fishing guide. And he would take parties in his powerboat to a spot about 12 miles northwest of the Sanibel Lighthouse, to a bed that he typically would pull a small wire screen metal dredge along the bottom and pick up the king's crown, the Genonias, the spiny oysters, the top dollar shells for these people that he took. And Jake and Ralph Woodring supplied the shell fare for many years for the live shell tanks at the aquarium. Tanks at the shell fair. I think Betty wants to touch on shell shops, but why don't I wrap up a little that I was going to cover on this?
Yeah.
And of course, all of this harvesting of live shells was mentioned in 1936. There were people that were very concerned with live shelling. They couldn't imagine how the resource could be sustained with over-harvesting. I always had a personal disconnect from that because I didn't buy into that biological part of it. When you stop and think that for nearly 2,000 years, the Calusa people, who numbered 10,000 strong, harvested everything they could eat out of the bay and out of the Gulf of Mexico. And they built these enormous middens and mounds out of millions, if not billions, of seashells. Yet the seashells were still here in a commercial position in the 1950s. How could live shelling really decimate the shells? Well, at the time, when this really struck a chord with the islanders, I was sitting on the city council, and we appointed a live shell committee to study the problem. And I was the ex officio member on the committee, along with people like Ann Jaffe, Bob Sabatino, George Campbell, and a few other folks that were interested in the seashell resource. And we were charged to come up with a candidate to do a biological study of the situation. And we did. We came up with a young lady who was going to earn her master's degree at the University of South Florida in St. Petersburg. She was very qualified to conduct the study, and I took that to the city council, and it fell on deaf ears. It was too costly. So an actual biological study was never determined. And then years later, the city came up with the resolution to permit only 2 live specimens per day, and finally a complete ban on live shelling. And that always hurt me, because I would go, and still could go, to areas, and I could collect quahog clams that are edible, and but they're protected now. I could collect coquina clams and make a delicious stew out of them, but I can't do that anymore. Cockles that are often so common on the beach are excellent eating. They have a great scallop, a little tougher than the ordinary scallop, but still delicious. And the pen shells that so clutter the beaches, when they're still alive, they have an edible mussel. So it took from part of that natural heritage for edible shells that people harvested and enjoyed from the take. So I was never happy with the live shelling ban. So I'll leave that subject with that opinion and let Betty pick it up. I don't know if she agrees with me or not.
Basically, there could be gradations. So yeah, I tend to think food resources. We can talk about that. Anyway, shell shops. Obviously, that really started in the 1950s. I think one of the first ones was the Glory of the Sea, which is now a rather derelict building down there near Bailey Shopping Center. Edie Mugridge ran it. Actually, she worked for Ken Havard for a while and then opened that, I believe.
But she was only here seasonal, but she moved here permanently.
Yeah, for a little while.
I think Ken had
might have been first
the
then.
First
okay, Seashell Industries.
Seashell Industries.
On Fitzhugh Street.
44, I think.
Okay. Yeah, I think Edie's shop opened around 1950-ish, more or less. But Edie was from Boston, and she was evidently quite prolific as far as water skiing and other water sports. She was also a diver, and an oral history that she had done with Jody Brown and I some years back, she was talking about having dived on the reefs and picking up shells in, really quite deep water, that she also sold in the shop. But But then there was also Elsie Malone, and when we first came to the islands, not too long afterwards, Elsie asked me to come to work for her. So I had kind of an insider's view of a specimen shell shop. Elsie was interested in worldwide shells, and not necessarily Sanibel specifically, although we obviously had a section of them, but worldwide shells that were live shelled. And it was kind of like stamp collecting, shell collecting was, and we'd be mailing things all over the world and receiving things from all over the world. It just occurred to me, I was thinking about slit shells, plurimaria shells that basically come from the Japanese area. There's some in Bermuda and other places, but Japan is a hotspot for shells of specimen quality. And it just occurred to me that in talking earlier about Louise Perry, she used to correspond with Emperor Hirohito right up until World War II began in 1941 for us. Just, that's an aside. But we had those slit shells on the shelf, some of them thousands of dollars. Shell shops have continued. There are quite a few of them here, and Charles mentioned the shell factory, which is a whole different animal. And then even back when I was working for the Elsies, there are two, mother and daughter, there was talk of making a shell museum and building it here on the island back in the early 1970s, for example. We used to have a number of people coming in, particularly around the time of the shell fair, that were shelling experts. And of course, Tucker Abbott is one of the most well-known names, would be in and out all the time. Eventually, he became the first director of the Shell Museum. And at the grand opening of the Shell Museum, we used to have a trolley business here on the island, and we moved people around. That was probably the last time that Anne Morrow Lindbergh was here on the island, but she came here for the opening of the Shell Museum. She was ill at that time, but she made an effort to be here for that. So I got to actually shake her hand, which, you know, cool thing. That's really kind of covered all the different topics, at least very shortly. And if you have any questions or whatever.
So from our members and our volunteers, we have questions. So when did the finding of Junonia become such a big find in the shelling world?
It's just that it was an unusual shell because it is a deep water shell. It's like a 200-foot level, so that's very far out on this side of our coast. And so it doesn't show up very often. And the shells that don't show up very often, even if they're common offshore, which a Junonia really isn't, but even if the shell is fairly common offshore, if it doesn't often wash up, it becomes more and more valued. Yeah. Okay. The same thing happens with things like lemon pectins, for example. The pectin shell that it grows in sponges, so very often you'll walk right by it and never even see it. But the common pectins are kind of brown. Sometimes you'll get an orange one. That's pretty darn good. And if you get both sides of the same shell, that's really good. But then when you get a bright lemon-colored one, that's just fantastic. So, you know, it's a matter of rarity.
So live shell collecting is illegal on Sanibel now, but is dredging illegal? And how do the shell wholesale suppliers get their inventory today?
Dredging, now you would need a permit for, a state permit to collect biological specimens. Even 50 years ago, you technically had to have that. I don't know of anyone that does no one does any live shelling trips from here anymore.
That I know
No
of,
dredging
no.
trips. There may be some off of Tampa, but I think they're after these mineralized rocks they find near the Sunshine Skyway. What was the other part of your question? I'm sorry.
How do wholesale suppliers, shell wholesale suppliers, get their inventory?
Okay, most of the Genonias that are sold in these shell shops are sold by shrimpers. There's also the spiny oyster and lion's paw. Shrimpers make a good secondary income when they're shrimping because of the seashells they collect. And that's where most of them come from.
As an addition, in terms of shrimping, very often somebody will find something very unusual, like the measled cowrie, a great big cowrie that comes from the area of the Keys or the Tortugas or whatever, and they'll find it on the beach here. Well, you know, it's hundreds of miles away. It didn't wash up here and, you know, stay in one piece. That came out of a shrimper's net as they were pulling them up or down and being shaken out.
Bycatch.
Bycatch.
Interesting. So there are several questions about why are the variety of the shells diminished from what we understand the variety of shells were many years ago.
I don't believe the variety of shells are diminishing, not the species.
Okay.
And we're still finding the rare shells, Genonias and occasionally lion's paws. I really have a hard time saying that the quantities of shells have diminished. There's a lot of factors included in why, and it's mostly weather events. I can remember in December of 1960, we had a cold front come through around the 12th, and the temperatures here dropped down to 22 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind blew incessantly for like 6 or 7 days out of the northwest, heaping shells up on the beach that you couldn't imagine today. But that's what it takes. We haven't had the weather events, and we may never have them again with
The
climate
climate
change.
is changing.
Okay.
Yeah, and the same concept, going back again to Louise Perry and her associates, talking about freezes here on the island and the number of freezes that happen like every 2 or 3 years, enough of a hard freeze that, you know, fish are floating on top. And everything's kind of, all of the trees have died and the leaves have fallen off. Back at the turn of the 1800s to the 1900s, when Frank Hamilton Cushing was on his way down to Marco Island, he came down through the various inland waterways on his way down there. He documented a number of Calusa Indian mounds on the way because the vegetation was almost totally destroyed by the pair of freezes that had happened in 1896. There was a freeze right around Christmas and a second freeze in mid-February, and it basically that is what pushed many of our settlers down this far south. They were farmers who were growing citrus in the center part of the state, or even growing crops as far north as Georgia. And they just gave up and went further down. There is the story of Julia Tuttle on the other coast handing Flagler orange blossoms on a branch, showing him that we didn't have a freeze here, bring your train down. That's the reason, or one of the reasons supposedly, that he ran his train line down, all the way down to Key West. There were a number of freezes that we just don't see today, as Charles says. Climate is changing.
Can you say a little more about what triggered the building of the Shell Museum?
Well, I think it was one of those groundswell things gradually, but as far as, people's desire to have a permanent place rather than just a couple of days once a year at the Shell Fair, because the Shell Fair was very oriented towards scientific information and collection, but it also had the art side and it had the live aquarium side. Even back in the 1930s, they were showing live critters in aquariums, and a children's division and all that sort of thing. But people had an interest that spanned longer than that. So it was kind of a case of, we really should do this. It was kind of a dream that gradually became a reality.
And is there a special time to go shelling for
When they're
different
there.
types of shelling, or what's the best location to go shelling on Sanibel or Captiva?
Yeah.
Well,
That's
After a bad cold front,
yeah.
I wouldn't
Windy
go on
day.
the beach to hunt shells unless those conditions were met.
If you've got to wear a big, heavy padded jacket, it's probably a great day to be shelling.
And there's no competition
Yeah.
when it's like that.
And the other thing is, in the winter and when it's cold, your low tides are lower than they are in the summertime. Even though you have hurricanes, perhaps, in the summertime, you don't have the same conditions that you do during winter cold fronts. So winter is really your better, if you've got to pick a season, the better time, and obviously low tides and, Yeah.
But it takes a long-term cold front. That wind has to be
Yeah.
sustained to get those organisms that are out there 200 feet, 12, 15, 20 miles offshore, to get them on the beach. But
Rolling
during
in.
that real severe cold front, it was like overnight, there were beautiful shells on the beach.
Yeah.
Are there shells that used to be more common, but they're non-existent or rare now?
I don't,
With shells, it's weird. You can walk down the beach and you seem to see nothing but scallops, and another time you see nothing but fighting conchs. And there's so many different factors at play, it's really hard to say. Wind coming from a slightly different direction brings in a whole different originating area. So I don't think anything has totally disappeared. You may see less of something, but even in my lawn, which is not a lawn, it's kind of a mowed meadow, but even in that, I have different kinds of wildflowers grow before we mow at different times of the year, and it's kind of that same concept. The conditions have changed, so whatever appears changes.
yeah, the nursery features of the estuary, Pine Island Sound, Charlotte Harbor, they're seldom damaged by wind events. because those animals are down secure in the mud. They could
That's
be,
why they're there.
yeah, they could be covered up by an overwash of sand or something like that and kill them. But they're still doing their thing. They're putting out spat that is countless. They're reproducing, and as long as the water quality
Yeah.
is good, they'll continue doing that.
Do you think the water quality, the red tide, has impacted the shells?
Well, it kills shells, yeah.
It will kill shells, but it also has been around for thousands of years, and it has been killing shells for thousands of years. I don't think that's really changed. On the other hand, what comes out of the Caloosahatchee or Okeechobee, that might be a different story.
And tunicates growing on shells, and the shells themselves are eaten by other organisms. Manatees eat the tunicates. The grass tunicates are growing on. They secondarily ingest the toxin. They die. In 1971, we had the worst red tide I was personally involved in on a day-to-day, night-to-night basis, because we were running the beach every night.
Yeah.
But there were only 18 turtles that washed in dead during that red tide event in '71 on Sanibel Captiva. This last major red tide a couple of years ago, there were, I guess, close to 100 strandings of dead turtles that were all secondarily
And the whale.
poisoned, and whale, and it's just the way things work. The way I don't know that when Betty and I write in our book, we don't put all the blame of nutrients coming out of the Caloosahatchee as responsible for red tide. Probably contribute something, but it's not responsible for the red tide. Like Betty said, the red tide's been here forever. The early Spanish recorded it in their journals.
Well, that's all of our questions, but I so appreciate you coming talking to the Historical Village this afternoon. We really appreciate it. Thank you for joining us for this volunteer update. Please check our website and at sanibelmuseum.org for future updates. We will have other really interesting speakers coming in our future volunteer updates, and they will be on our website.